Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great privilege and honor to call on the first of two panels, which we will be having one after the other. And I have no opening remarks to make because, frankly, Jeff covered most of the landscape. While we may disagree here and there, we generally agree with the need to mobilize investment for adaptation and resilience in the developing countries, not just for mitigation in the advanced countries. Now, with one caveat, because clearly China is a major emitter as well, and it's kind of straddling the line between advanced and developing countries. So China plays a big role, as do other countries like India, but primarily China. Africa, of course, is the recipient of the consequences of climate change, much more so than any other way. Our panel today will look at the rethinking of national strategies for confronting climate change in the light of the changing political realities. And I think that the speech, the session with Jeff Sachs was a good setting for that discussion. National strategies have been based on voluntary declarations by countries in the light of the Paris Accord of 2015, or of their commitment to the SDGs also in 2015, or the Sendai Principles in 2015, have now been thrown awry, partly by the problems we have had with the pandemic, and partly, of course, with the accelerated effects of climate change. So how can we move towards a multilateral framework where countries will collaborate to try to get the kind of changes that we want, both in the decarbonizations and emissions on one side, but also in helping the developing countries with adaptation and resilience, especially since we witness that the problems of climate change are already here. Just look what's happening right now with the heat waves on one side, forest fires, on the other side, floods, droughts, etc. Our panel, our distinguished panel, includes Mr. Amr Moussa, former Secretary General of the Arab League and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. His Excellency Rosen Plevnev, President of Bulgaria. Her Excellency Eka Tekashvili, Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia and Minister of Foreign Affairs. And Her Excellency Amina Goreb Fakim, President of Mauritius. I will now turn to the panelists and say that I would like to give each of you about 3 to 4 minutes to make an opening statement. We'll go through the whole panel and then come back again for discussions and questions among the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the floor. With that, let me turn to Amr Moussa as my first speaker on this panel. Dr. Amr Moussa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ismail. Much has been said in the last 4 days or so. So I believe that we can use the 4 minutes allotted to us and perhaps also some suggestions. The first one is about the alliance that should be established among states to deal, in terms of cooperation, deal with the problems created by climate change. I believe that this alliance should undermine.
Dr. Amr, we seem to be having some problems with the audio. May I ask our colleagues to please look into the audio?
Should I suspend the video to help the audio?
It may help, but I think you are muted. I see here a muted sign. Network connection.
Am I still muted?
Yeah, now you're being listened to better. Speak closer to your mic, to your mic, please.
I'm speaking as close as
Yes, that's good. Now it's good. Now we can hear you.
Thank you very much. So that's my 4 or 5 minutes starts now, Ismail. The issue of, I was saying that the issue of alliance to work, to cooperate against the climate change effects should be an alliance of societies, of civil societies, among states, not only governments, but civil societies, and whom I call that the civil society should move quickly and effectively in cooperation with others, other similar organizations on national level, on regional level, and on international level. I believe that Jeff Sachs was correct in referring to the 2 meetings that are coming to take place in 2 developing nations, Egypt and Indonesia. So we'll have to make the most possible effect in our contacts with other countries, other societies, the civil society, to plan for the future on the basis of cooperation. That's number 1. Second point is about the international system and how it deals with this problem. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, 2 years ago, was speaking about the new challenges, not only to the world in general terms, but in the field of threats to international peace and security. And he suggested that the Security Council Authority
4 ديسمبر سبتمبر 4 سبتمبر من 4 9 ل 4 12. طيب ماشي اوكي.
Ismail, should I continue?
Yes, please do. Please do.
Should I continue? I was interrupted by.
Please do.
Oh, okay. The Secretary General of the UN suggested that the term threats to international peace and security should include the new challenges, just like pandemics, or in particular pandemics and climate change. Therefore, the new international system, the renovation of the international system, should contribute to the fight against the effects, the adverse effects of climate change.
The picture is frozen.
When it comes to the Security Council addressing those issues that are threats to the whole international community, not to this or that bloc, and has nothing to do with the emerging on the international scene. I believe that we, the international community, veto powers in the Security Council against pandemics, coordination in our effects and policies to deal with also to mitigate the veto powers, to veto when it comes to resolutions dealing with the issue of climate change, to mitigate as much as they can. We need a gentleman agreement, a new way of addressing the system, that yes, when it comes to threats to our life, nation, on any level, we call on the veto powers not to, or to refrain as much as they can from the community of humanity dealing with such, I believe, has to come to concrete formulation to an address in an appeal by the international community to cooperate with us and go as a block one Earth, using or blocking such activity by a veto. We cannot prevent them, but we appeal to them to mitigate as much as they can. Then I move to a third point, which is what I have read in some articles in magazines and periodics dealing with climate change, that there is a thinking now of establishing a criminal tribunal for climate change. The argument is that the issues that has developed and posed the international community for issues, certain issues, and to appeal or to deal with the Interpol and other systems to block the crimes, international crimes. It is also very logical for us to think, is it not the time? Is it not an important issue for us to think of establishing such a tribunal? A debate on that should be suggested. The certification, the havoc caused by a lot of policies to the ocean, the expansion of the certification and so on. Such policies intended to do that, to reach that community, debated in the Security Council of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and sent to such a tribunal to consider who is the real criminal. Policies intended to do that, or ignorance, or other bad intentions that should be indeed put before international judges. It's not a political confrontation or a political debate, but it goes beyond that. The legal commitment to ensure that climate change will be mitigated and policies will be directed to help such mitigation, and also would lead also to the commitments that have been made and violation of commitments, as what Jeff was referring to, and also Ismail, about the commitment to spend billions for intentionally harming the interests of developing nations, in dealing with that. They were the least, those ideas, role a new role for the Security Council. A debate about or thinking of establishing a court, criminal court for climate for the climate violations would be two ideas of importance. That's in my opinion. The next point is about women, the role of women in dealing with climate change in developing nations, in particular in Africa and Asia. I would add also Latin America. In many societies over there, women, it depends on women to educate their children, to direct their lives about how to.
That's a good point on which to wrap up this intervention, because we have two very remarkable women coming right after you, Amr, and you have challenged us to think of a criminal tribunal and compensation above and beyond the conventional ways of negotiating support of the $100 billion that was promised in the past.
My intervention, Ismail, I would wrap up my intervention by calling for a campaign to educate people, especially those uneducated around the world, to educate them about the new challenges and their roles, and help them, help us, and help our drive to reach that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. May I now turn to Her Excellency Eka Tikashvili. She had her hand up earlier, but now's a good chance to come in. Now that Jeff and Amr have laid down the groundwork, and we'd love to have you share with us some thoughts about what you see that we could do to weave together this global alliance that will take care of adaptation and resilience for the poor, in addition to dealing with the mitigation of emissions in the rich countries.
Thank you, Ismail. I want to greet everybody today at the meeting. It's a pleasure to be here with you and then have an opportunity to address you. I have to say that I'm still going through a bit of an aftershock of Jeff's presentation, so it unsettled my mind to the degree that I have to collect back my thoughts, because I've been sitting here, Georgian representative of a country that has suffered twice, and myself personally, wars with Russia. Have been evacuated from Ukraine when the war against Ukraine started by Russia. So I have to say that personally, it's the 3 times that I have to be displaced because of Russian military operations in my country, in our brotherly nation country like Ukraine. And then to hear an explanation that it's a proxy war, as if we are not existent as the nations who are trying to be free and decolonize ultimately ourselves from the former empire Russia. And it's the war about NATO and US. I'm sorry to say it's hypocritical. The world is not about the US. The world is not about the EU. We have our own agency and we are fighting for our own freedom. So this war is about freedom, sovereignty, and then finalization of decolonization of the space that Russia as a former empire colonized for quite some time in our part of the world. And I would really believe, and I hope that all of our friends and colleagues in the parts of the world that have suffered from colonialism in their history would very clearly understand what it means for us when somebody else is talking to us what our future should be, and we are not given the right to have an agency what our future should be. And we have to fight and shed the blood when it comes to having the future that we believe as the nations that we deserve. So in that sense, I'll end with that. This event is not about the wars. This event is not about geopolitics. And certainly, I hope so, this event is not about how great Russia is or how civilized Russia is or could be anytime soon, unless Russia is defeated in its attempt to reinstate its own empire in the space and beyond, that it thinks that its margins of imperialism should be extended. Now, when it comes to the subject matter of discussion that we actually have at hand today in front of us, we do see quite clearly, and again, I would hope that in every part of the world, that without having clear view how much we are running out of time to put our efforts together, to see how as a humanity we can go through these challenging times that our planet is facing, partially because of us, not fully, but partially because of us, then we decide subconsciously or consciously to doom our future generations to extreme hardships. And we already see change in the pattern of climate in so many countries. It's not an invention. It's not something that we hear only from part of the scientists, if not the all, but we go through that in our lifetime now. In my own country, in countries in my own neighborhood, and look, we are talking now when the third of Pakistan is under the water. It's extremely challenging for so many societies that have already suffered for economic reasons, and then for the lack of the degree of development that the societies needed for so many times. So in that regard, I think part of what I would want to emphasize in my introduction is that we need to have very targeted and tailor-made projections that needs to be made how climate change in itself has all the reasons to be seen as the cause of the new conflict situations within the societies and internationally as well. And here I don't only refer to the water or the land that could be harvested for food, but the massive migration of massive amount of people, especially younger generation, from countries within the regions and extra the regions as well. And in this case, what are the instincts that in self-defensive mode could be then switched on in the societies that otherwise could have been open for migration previously, but could be stressed to the degree that that could cause them to be closed, and that could be the reason then for conflicts that could spin beyond the borders in which the societies could be strained economically. We have seen that already in the past. We've seen that in the African continent more than in other continents perhaps, but we are all intertwined. There is no division in terms of what is the impact that the development in one continent now takes on another. And we have seen that in the war in Ukraine, by the way, how actions of Russia, including bombing and destruction of the agrarian land, inability of Ukrainians to harvest their harvest, to transport their harvest internationally, when Ukraine is the breadbasket for so many globally, already has caused extreme strains on the provision of food and particularly grains internationally. And understanding the scale of mined land in Ukraine right now, and understanding what it will take for that to be already ready for harvesting and then work in the years to come in Ukraine, that crisis will not fade away very soon. It will take time before supply chains could be back on track, provided that the war in Ukraine ends with the Ukrainian victory in this case. So we've seen already how large-scale conflicts already had impact on a global scale, but we sometimes overlook the impact of the conflicts that are taking place on the local scale because they don't have that international reach and impact perhaps, but they are devastating for the local communities. So in that sense, the question that we've talked so many times in different events on what is the international system and reform of that could provide the chance for multilateralism in the way that we would find it fair and just as much as pragmatically feasible, so that there is no perception that some nations matter and some nations that simply don't because they are neighbors of some nations that matter in the perception of some. That will not be a solution that could have any sustainability in it or hope for that either. So I guess geopolitics and then questions related to international system are unavoidable when we speak about climate and what could be the solutions to sustainable resolution of problems that are extremely painful already for so many different societies. But then, as I've said in the beginning, we do need to think about how climate change in its own pace as well and place contributes potentially soon enough, if we are not active already now, to more conflicts that could occur and then more instabilities regionally. My final point within the short contribution that we could make with the time limits that we have is about energy. And here again, our part of the world is a good example, I guess, how disillusioned for quite some time, not disillusioned, but I guess how unpragmatic at the end of the day Europe was for so many years, decades basically, by having an understanding that energy is not the tool for political games or even the tool of leveraging for the countries like Russia, and then had an understanding that cooperation, economic calculus, having all the agreements that we had done with Gazprom for that matter, were the good foundation and framework for them to be reliant on relatively cheaper gas in some countries where they had a closer relations with Russia, like Germany, and then others in the same European continent suffered by much higher prices from the same Gazprom, and then that equality was sustained for quite some time. But more than that, what we see now, we see a complete rupture of supplies of energy when we speak about gas from Russia to Europe. It's not Europe that made the first step, which it should have perhaps early on, to become more independent from Russia. But now we see that Russia is not even playing any game, that we have a country as big as Russia is, member of the Security Council of the UN, that is openly using energy and food as a leverage and blackmailing tool for so many other nations. So in that regard, I think when we speak about climate, I would hope that is an awakening moment for nations that thought that fossil fuels and reliance on cheaper or abundance of gas and supplies of energy from the countries like Russia could sustain the economic growth. And it was okay to overlook renewables, to overlook the green energy agenda, and by that, with disregard for the climate agenda, in that regard, arguing always about the economic profitability that the fossil fuels would provide. In this case, it's an awakening moment. It's good that we have countries like Azerbaijan who could help now countries that are suffering from that energy play of Russia by supplying more energy and sustaining the needs as much as it's possible at this point of time. But we do have to understand that in addition to the fossil fuels, renewables, and then green energy agenda is the agenda that needs to be formed now and acted upon now. It's an awakening moment, I'm sure, for Europe, and I would hope that it's an awakening moment globally as well. The future is not distant, it's already happening now. Every step we make in the present shapes our future in the short term and in the long term as well. So I would say that the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, not in Ukraine, aggression against Ukraine by Russia, should be an awakening moment for international community without divisions, without North and South, East and West. It is about values and principles upon which international community is formed, and we would hope is coexisting with each other and shaping the future. And in that regard, freedom, sovereignty, and independence of nations matter. And then what will be the future in terms of sustainability of that, and climate in that sense is a pivotal part of that, matters in terms of what we will leave our future generations to live in as an environment and context. So in that sense, my message is of urgency and of awakening, I would say, against the background of that brutal war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine.
Thank you, Eka, for this impassioned intervention, and I share much of what you said. But I would like to ask you to please think about one more point, which I'll come back to you again for. In the end, we are talking about how are we going to create a coalition, alliance, diplomatically and otherwise, in order to tell the world, okay, rich countries, we know China, US, and Europe are primary emitters, and they have taken some pledges, and maybe they can do more or less on that. But fundamentally, the poor countries are suffering right now, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from right now. And as we said, I think Pakistan, with 33 million people displaced from their homes, is unheard of from a flood. So the $100 billion that were promised before and have never been met, how can we create the kind of coalition of the caring that would enable us to get the rich countries to support the developing countries, both in terms of adaptation projects and resilience projects? Now that's not a technical scientific question, because the science is already there. It's really more of a diplomatic question about where can we find the right regional champions who would together be able to weave together a coalition of countries that would support really and truly funding $100 billion a year, like has been promised for so many years now.
Shall I respond now, Ismail, or later? What's your preference?
As you wish. You want to answer now?
You
want to think about it a bit more while we listen to Amina and then come back to you? Okay. Then let me now turn to Her Excellency Amina Ghoreb Fakim, President of Mauritius. Mauritius is a very special place, wonderful place. My heart is there. Had the pleasure of visiting there. But it's also part of Africa. So, Madam President, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ismail, and also good to see you again back in action. We've missed you for the past few months, but good to see you in good spirit. I've been listening to the discussion, and I've also listened to what Jeffrey has said in his keynote address. I'm not going to dent the enthusiasm of us going to Sharm el-Sheikh. It's a wonderful place, and I'm sure we're going to have a great meeting. But what is going to come out of this meeting? Again, that's the next question we have to ask ourselves, because to me personally, the most successful COP has been in Paris, because this is when we came up with this famous notion of common but differentiated approach towards solving the problem, the crisis. And Paris has been successful for one main reason, is that there has been the voluntary contribution from all regions, from all parts of the world, into addressing this crisis. But what has also been pledged in Paris has never materialized. And I think Ismail had just mentioned this $100 billion, which had been promised and of course never happened. So now that we have climate as the existential crisis that the world is witnessing, and Pakistan is of course the poster child of this crisis, how do we bring ourselves together to address not just migration, because we know that Africa is going to be again the continent where by 2030, I think the figures state, we're going to see millions of people on the move. And a lot of it, of course, down to the climate crisis. How do you address food security? I mean, how does a country like Pakistan ensure food security with over 30 million people who have been displaced and everything has been destroyed? And how do you address the future pandemics? Because the COVID we have seen so far will not be the last one. There'll be many more, especially in light of our changing climate and everything that goes with it. Because we will see, for example, malaria moving to other parts of the world that hadn't experienced malaria before. So we are seeing many moving parts, not just in the food security, in health, we've seen the Sendai framework, which of course, I'm not going to say obsolete, but I think it is really being challenged big time with what's happening now. The accelerated climate crisis we're witnessing is, I think, unfortunately, only the beginning of what we're going to see more further down the line. Now, how do you bring about solutions to this? I'll be very, very blunt here again. For as long as climate was hitting the poorer nations, the northern countries just ignored it because it was the problem of the south. I mean, there has been so many drought before, there have been so many fires before, there has been so many flooding before, but the world did not take notice because, unfortunately, I have to cite what the Foreign Secretary of India said. The world's problem was not Europe's problem, but Europe's problem is the world's problem. So now we are seeing, we're taking on board the fact that we only have one planet, and that's planet A. There is no planet B. Now, how do you bring about this? We have seen over the past few years the gradual erosion of the authority of the multilateral system. We have seen at the level, of course, at the level of the Security Council. I mean, you can have all the decisions taken at the General Assembly, addressing all the issues and get vetoed at the Security Council. Now, how do you bring about changes? How do you bring about respectability of other countries' needs when this scenario, which is completely outdated, still decide for the rest of the world? So again, I'm not going to say we're going to modify, of course, kind of relook at the Security Council just yet. But we're going to have to put back the authority where it needs. And one place I think that we need to really seriously look at, of course, in terms of finances, we really have to look at institutions like the IMF. We really need to look at the SDRs so that it gives the poorer countries ways and means of addressing the immediate crisis. And we are not going to see that until the rest of the world tell the G7 that they matter, that they exist. And it's only as, again, I have to go back to what Jeffrey said, when we have big countries, emerging countries, like the Indonesia, like what India is also on board, We're going to have to look at places like Brazil and the global South, Africa. They're going to have to start knocking on the table because we exist. And unfortunately, we have been marginalized and we are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. Africa contributed less than 4%. And yet we have seen Pakistan has contributed less than 1%. And look what's happening. Now, who is going to speak? Who is going to bring? And I haven't seen the rallying call around this cause. We haven't seen them making such major headlines. Unfortunately, I have to say this. We haven't seen Pakistan making as much headlines as Ukraine, right? Ukraine, we're talking about 6 million people that have been displaced or slightly more. But here we're talking about 30 million plus. And there's going to be more. Now, how do we bring about this rallying call around the cause of these poorer people who deserve equal attention, who deserve the credit, who deserve the funds, who deserve the support? How do you bring it? How does the multilateral system bring to bear this crisis, which is hanging not just on the head of the global South, but also on the global North now? So we have to really think of our approach. We really have to think our multilateral system. We really have to think about one word which has defined many decisions in the world, and that one word is greed. How do you address inequality? How do we address inequality when we have seen so much riches transferred to the rich already for the past 2 years during the COVID crisis? Now, how do we bring to bear these initiatives which calls for greater cooperation, for greater collaboration? And how do we prevent more wars happening when big players stop provoking the other regions, the other countries who have dared to succeed? And one here, I have an example, is China. Why does the US keep on provoking China? Let it be. Let it emerge. It's a country that has over 3,000 years of history. So why can't it emerge as one player? And we need the collaboration of all these big countries, emerging countries, to be able to address the challenges that this world is facing. And up until we don't have this collaboration, we are still going to have, I'm sorry to say this, another empty cup. So that's my take, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President, for this impassioned plea as well. But I will sort of remind us here that simply having a large number of countries in developing countries, let's say, or caring about this, maybe with a few other countries as well, is not enough to really generate the support that we need. We need to do more. And I will remind you, well, you're young and beautiful, so this long before you, many years ago in 1973, I believe, we had a General Assembly session at the UN, which was presided over by then a very young Minister of Foreign Affairs from Algeria, Mr. Bouteflika at the time, and which said we need a new economic order. And the new economic order was, most of us would agree with what it said about sharing and equity and responsibilities and environment and so on. And invariably, because it was a General Assembly, not the Security Council, the G7 at the time were being systematically overruled by the vast majority of the General Assembly. And at the end of it, the G7 said, okay, you passed your proposal for a new economic order, now go and implement it. Go and implement it. We are not going to do it, so you do whatever you want to do. So we had all the votes, we had the unanimous opinion of the developing world, overwhelming majority in the General Assembly of the UN, but in the end, 7 key votes, which were the 7 industrial countries of the West at the time, simply said, okay, you overruled us on, as we went along on each item of the proposed new economic order. So now go and implement it by yourselves. And of course, you know, it remained as an aspirational document, but it did not change the reality of what we had to do. We really have to think about this, because we thought we had something that was done in Paris in 2015 when individual countries set their own targets. And we decided even that was not enough. Incidentally, yesterday I intervened to say something which I will repeat here. The only country in the whole world that is on target both with its Paris promises and to meet the targets of decarbonization by 2030 and 2050, believe it or not, is Gambia, one of the smallest countries in the world, which is in West Africa. But the only one. Everybody else is not fulfilling their promises. And those who will still get us way above 2.5, 2.7 degrees, not 1.2, not 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we still have problems, but we need to somehow think of how we can build together a winning coalition and alignment diplomatically and otherwise. And I would hope that by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, we will have some ideas on that. Now, having said that, I'd like to go back to Eka, because I promised her that I would get back to her, and then back to you, Madam President, and then to Amr Moussa back again. So please, Eka, go ahead.
Sure. I think part of what I would want to highlight in this regard, in the short term, what is it that we need to do and build up coalitions and actions, alliances that could actually deliver somewhat in the short term rather than in the distant future. We have to broaden the horizon beyond the state entities as such, and then international organizations, which are intergovernmental organizations. We do see that when it comes to the climate, and particularly in the US, the centralized bodies when it comes to the cities, and then when it comes to the governors, and then private businesses are much more forthcoming rather than the state institutions in the central level. And we see that the coalitions are being built right now between different cities and mayors, and then the corporations. Private business is an integral part of the equation. So for bridging that gap of what is economically feasible, so that by having more action and investment that is in line what is expected to act on a climate change agenda, we need to bring in all the actors that are actually delivering jobs, that are delivering economic action, so that we do have the buy-in of those institutions, of those entities, those who are much closer to people who are actually dependent on their jobs, economic development of their own countries, so that what seems to be the dilemma, what is feasible or not economically, while acting on climate challenges, is destroyed as a perception. And then we do have a common agenda between private business and then societies and then the state institutions, that there is not that much of a dilemma, but rather a challenge that can be dealt with. So in that regard, my understanding is that we're still very much preoccupied with traditional actors who used to be the drivers of change and leadership and remain to be so, obviously, to some important degree, but then they are not anymore those who are movers of the type of the change that we need to have in order to have any progress that could be tangible enough in sustaining now our societies with the upcoming challenges of the climate change that we already experience.
Thank you. I hope that we can follow such a path at COP27, because time is running out for the developing countries, indeed. And now, Mr. Amr Moussa, you had even gone as far as to suggest a tribunal, setting up a tribunal or setting up compensation or something or both. So we need to be able to see what we can do, and I would urge that if you can help us visualize how we can weave together this coalition of the caring to carry the day when we come to COP.
Well, thank you, Ismail. Let me first comment on the interventions of ECA and Amina, raising a lot of political problems that have affected the international scene and caused also problems pertaining to the climate change and other problems. We in the Middle East, for example, in our region, we also suffer from the existence of problems that would raise questions about how, in certain areas of our region, how are we going to protect them or help them protect their territories and their people from the rigors of climate change. I raise here the issue of the Palestinian territories, the Palestinian Authority. How are we going to help them take care of their territory under foreign occupation? So as we are raising the issue of Ukraine or the issue of China, US, I would raise the issue pertaining to the Middle East and to the Palestinian question itself that has been ignored. And the question is within the framework of climate change. That politics cannot be separated from the, when we discuss the issues pertaining to climate change or any other issue, right? But since we are mentioning problems, I felt I have to put on that agenda other problems that we consider as so important not to ignore. As for the coalition, before, the issue of coalition should not be only between governments and countries members of international organizations, but also enough space to establish such coalitions with the as you said, we can bring them up, help them. Them contribute to the establishment of such a coalition. Is it the usual traditional definition or a new definition pertaining to the 21st century where the civil society is equal in its importance of in dealing with such matters as those of governments? How can we do that? Of course, we can do that through regional organizations. We can do that in Africa through the African Union, in the Arab world through the Arab League, in Europe through the European Union, and in Asia and the Pacific through those organizations. And then it's coming up, and I believe it is there in such arena coalitions, as Jeff mentioned, the COP27, the G20 forthcoming meetings in Egypt and in Indonesia. Those are also places where the issue of coalition, of alignment, of one stand for all of us, and to listen to the grievances of the poor countries being left out, and all the promises, all commitments have not been implemented. This is an issue that will bring us all as a goal for the Amina said, we are here too. It is not a question for the big powers or rich powers only. We are here, and without our cooperation as developing nations, I don't think the world would come to a consensus that would be helpful in dealing with climate change.
Thank you indeed. I'm now going to go back to President Amina, but before I do that, I want to add one more thing for her consideration as well. The public opinion has had an enormous shift during the past 50 years. If you recall, my late good friend Maurice Strong was Secretary General of the first Environment and Development Conference in Stockholm, and he had 3 heads of state and government. By the time we had the second one, 20 years later in Rio, Maurice Strong was still the Secretary General of that, we had created UNEP in the United Nations, and he was Secretary General of the Rio Earth Conference as well. And we had 114 heads of state and government attended Rio. And Maurice, God rest his soul, when asked by the press, how many leaders do you have in Rio? And he said, well, we had 3 in Stockholm. We have 114 heads of state of government, but very few leaders. In the sense that there were real leaders willing to transform the world. There were some, like then Senator Al Gore and others, but there were relatively few true leaders there. Now, we have, I think, between the 2 events, we've had the environmental movement globally rise. People defending forests, people defending whales, people defending this and that. But finally, they had generated sometimes green political parties in Europe and elsewhere. But fundamentally, there was a great public appreciation of the problems. But there was a lagging appreciation of the leadership in terms of either private sector or public sector, with the net result that the institutional arrangements that are needed to address these kinds of challenges right now, whether it is by financing or increasing the, as President Amina mentioned, increasing the SDR allocations in the IMF or elsewhere, finding other means of doing that will require that this public mobilization of a whole new generation of young people around these issues be translated into the political will of the various countries, and that we can form a coalition, what I call a coalition of the caring. People who say, yes, we have to bear our responsibilities vis-a-vis future generations, and we have to bear our responsibilities vis-a-vis the poor and the vulnerable among our nations right now. And therefore, we shall do the following, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, that's the key issue. Otherwise, we will have, the likelihood will be we will get more general declarations of principle. Yes, isn't it too bad that things are happening, whether in Pakistan or in the Sahel in Africa or elsewhere? But what can we do about it? We'll try to do something. We'll think about it. But that's not good enough. Time is now gone. We must actually move. So we're back to weaving this coalition. And President Amina, would you care to take up where you left off on this point, which I promised to come back to you about? Here we are. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. You've raised a few points there already, Ismail, is this idea of political leadership and how do you distill that political will. The problem is that, just go back to what has been said, what Amare has said and what Eka has also said, and also what Jeff has said, is that there is a fear, a general fear in the public that climate change is real, climate change is a danger, but there seems to be a disconnect between what the people are feeling and what is happening at the level of the political where the decision gets taken. I think we all agree that climate change is mostly because of emission. And countries have set themselves target that by 2060 or 2070, they're going to be carbon neutral. But I think nature is telling us something much more important, that she's not going to wait until we decide to become carbon neutral. So what do we do in the meantime to try and address emission? And I think this is where quite important structural decisions have to be taken. And I think one of the major decisions we have to take is about reducing emission. And we know that the biggest contributor of emission, of course, is the fossil fuel industry, the way we consume. And how do we address, for example, the subsidies? I mean, if you really talk about distribution, if you really want to see other sectors emerging which can help address the emission issue, I think we have to look at the subsidies. And this is where we call for the leadership. And the leadership of this world have to decide whether they will keep on subsidizing an industry which is contributing to this, which is helping destroying our own livelihoods, and what are the mechanisms that we're going to put at disposal to other actors that can help reduce that emission. And this is something, is the elephant in the room that no one is willing to address, and we need to address it as a matter of urgency. So to come back again to this issue of the coalition of the caring, the coalition of the willing, we have to see to it that these institutions are listened to and taken more seriously. And even if we had to go back to the tribunal that Amre has said, I don't know how it's going to materialize, but I think we're going to have to start naming and shaming. I mean, those countries, those institutions were not doing the job. And I think we also have to go back to this famous green fund, not 100 billion, but more, because we need to ensure that developing countries, for example, those which are more vulnerable, they have access to the technologies to adapt. And those that can mitigate, can mitigate. But globally, we're going to have to create this awakening that funds have to be redistributed. They have to be, people have to be empowered that can make a change, can actually do so. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to see who is willing to distill that political will, because this is, I think, the hardest part, because there is such an incestuous way of business operating with the political class and vice versa, that to be able to make a dent there will require precisely that very infamous political will, which could be quite difficult to harness, quite difficult to distill. So we have to tackle the root cause, and the root cause will be to better empowerment, a stronger multilateral system, and this can happen if we have a strong and functioning, UN system to begin with. But we need to see to it that this comes to bear, because otherwise we are doomed.
Thank you, President Amin. Thank you. I now have questions from members of the audience here, and I'll start with Professor Adel Beltagi.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you, Excellency Amina. We met in Baku before. And talking about frankness, I think Jeffrey Sachs, he gave us an injection of openness and frankness in the morning, and we should continue on this path. Why we have this webinar? We were trying to focus on what really counts for developing countries, and this is adaptation. You can do mitigation, it will take years and years to show up. Even if we stop all the gases now, it will take more than 50 years to make a dent in decreasing the temperature. Therefore, when I go back to the global ecosystem assessment, I was member of this board, and we published all the major reports in 2006, 800 scientists. And what happened? Very little. Nobody's listening. The translation box is not there to action. I remember I used to have a lot of discussion with my late father. He was a businessman. And I was telling him as a young man at that time that I want no one language, no borders, and one governing system which cater for the whole world. And he used to laugh, and he said, wait until 20 years from now, and you will change your opinion. You will see the reality of the world. I think after all these years, I'm approaching 80 now. With all these years, I am returning back to the concept. And I would like to hear your opinion, Excellencies, Minister Amr Musa, and all of you, because this is very challenging. We are complaining about something which is not happening. There was wonderful people in the UN system as secretaries. I mean, we mentioned UNEP. Now it's headed by Inga Anderson, a wonderful lady, and she's trying to do her best. I'm not talking about the persons in the UN system. I'm talking about the governance politically in the UN. We need to change this governance. It has to change. Security Council composition. It has to change. You cannot hold the aspiration of the many for the few, saying that we are the only source of wisdom. This cannot happen. And therefore, we need to think seriously of this. Minister Amr Musa has faced this on the level of the Arab League. He tried to make a revolution on reforming the Arab League. I think he's intellectually still trying, but I would like to hear the real answers from you. Is it possible to change the governance in order to make the voice of the few heard and the other people who has other interests listen? Thank you.
Okay, President Amina, Eka, Amr, all welcome to pitch in. Last 3 or 4 minutes for each, and then we will be wrapping up this panel.
Professor, again, yes, I recall our meeting in Baku and have fond memories of how we discussed about agriculture. And the thing is that you mentioned, we touched on something which is so important. We have a system, we have a governance system, a world governance system that is outdated. It stems back immediately after the Second World War. It was designed for keeping peace. But is the system still relevant to addressing challenges that we're facing now? Climate change being one of them. Poverty, inequality, you name it, we all have it there. Now, I've said this all the time, and I will say it again. We have a system which excludes so many people of the global south. I mean, Africa is not present. Africa is 1.4 billion, heading up to 2 billion by 2050. I hope that by 2050 we'll have reform of the Security Council. We have 2 countries, 2 previous colonial powers. They're still present, occupying 40% of the Security Council membership. I mean, this is no longer possible. It is completely anachronistic. It is completely irrelevant. But we have now, just I think last week, India now is the 5th biggest economy. It has displaced UK from that perch of 5th largest economy in the world. And yet India doesn't have a place at the UN Security Council. So this is the thing that we have to look at. We have to look at a system which is relevant, which is fit for purpose. And unfortunately, we don't see that. And I don't think the big players are willing to actually move out or accept, co-opt other members who can have a say in world affairs. But beyond this, let us forget the geopolitical, let us forget this. I think we need a system that will have to hold people to account. I mean, Kofi Annan at some point when he set up the MDGs actually tried to hold people to account when they don't actually deliver on the MDGs. Now, are we going to have this system of tribunal? Are we going to name and shame when they don't deliver? But I think we have to move fast because climate change is not going to wait for us until by 2060 when we decide to be carbon neutral. We had an emergency, and this emergency has to be tackled by already existing institutions, but given them the powers. But more importantly, have this cooperation among the big players that there is no planet B. And I think that the faster the US, faster the G7 wake up to this reality, the more results we'll get on the ground.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to hear from also from Eka and from Amr, please. Hello. Amr, go ahead.
Who takes the floor first? Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
we hear you. Go ahead.
You hear me? Okay, thank you very much. And in fact, the regional organizations will have to play a principal role in pertaining to the climate change in the regions. The African Union has started, and myself as member of the panel of WISE, the African Union, we started to raise the issue of cooperation in the field of climate change and pandemics and the new items. I really think that all other regional organizations across the board in the world, from Latin America to Asia to Europe to Africa, will have to take that into consideration. The issue is serious, and not only the political problems that should have the priority, but also the climate change and how to cooperate and how to create alliances and how to express the views of developing nations vis-a-vis the rich countries. That's number one. Number two, I must say I enjoyed very much the intervention of Amina Hanem on the issues of this webinar. She has always been a very eloquent speaker, a spokeswoman for Asia and for developing nations in Asia and across the board. Am I still in? I'm still in? I'm still in?
Yes, you are still here.
Yes, go ahead there.
The image is frozen. Please, can you deal with it? Hello?
I'm still in? Yes,
You are in. Please go ahead.
No, you are muted. I can't hear you, Amr. You are muted. You are muted, please, Amr. You are muted. Unmute yourself. No, he is
you hear me
unmuted.
now?
Now you're okay.
Please, unmute.
Unmute, please.
I
Now is okay.
Now it's okay.
Yeah, somebody is muting me, but I'll try. I will do the same, everything I can in order to continue to speak. The issue I wanted to add in answering or commenting on the question of Dr. Beltagi is that in the Middle East region, we have serious challenges to environment. One of them, or one most important of them, is the nuclear policy. The nuclear weapons are now threatening not only the stability, but the environment of all the countries and in the Middle East and the Mediterranean itself. And when I talk about the nuclear power and the nuclear competition and the creation of a very dangerous nuclear situation in the region, has to be looked at also from the angle of environment, threats to environment. I here refer to not only to Iran, but also to Israel, because both of them have nuclear policies and really threatening the stability, the environment, and peace in the region. That is why, as part of the consideration of a better region, more stable, ready to develop, ready to contribute,
Yeah, we seem to be having a problem with the internet.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
Am I
Yeah.
on still?
Yes, you're on, Amr. So
Ismail.
please wrap it up, please. As soon as you, yeah, please.
Okay. Yes, I'll wrap it up by calling for the establishment of a zone free from all weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and rid the region and the vast region around the Middle East, including the Mediterranean, including the Eurasia and the other countries in Africa and Asia. This is an issue that has to be probed together with the complications on the international situation, together with the issue of Ukraine and Russia and the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Let me now turn to Deputy Prime Minister Eka. You have the floor.
Yes,
I will be very brief, and I'd like to
Never.
follow up on that.
Never breathe.
Do you hear me? Because
Yes, yes, we can
Sure.
hear you.
When we speak about adaptation in this case, and then imminent needs that we already face in so many societies, and I have to say that my own country is not an exception to that. We already suffer quite a bit when it comes to inflation, when it comes on food and prices of that, and droughts and then fires all over the country this summer, which has been shocking to many in my own society. It's vivid for everybody. But when we speak about adaptation, we cannot avoid the questions again connected with innovation, technologies, and then what the private businesses could contribute to that. When we do have a chance to see what are the technological advancements allowing not to waste water, for example, so that one can use it for different purposes in the way that in any given community and society, we could avoid any waste of water, and then to be as efficient as we can be. Early warning systems, technologies that could allow to deal with fire much better than ever when it comes to the urban environments or with the forestries and then the plains. We have to be innovative how to engage businesses and solutions from the private sector in the way that we could get the help and assistance for adaptation purposes as soon as possible. And I think that what the developed world owes developing world in this direction is to ensure what could be the capital that could be available for that business solutions to be available for the broader spectrum of the countries and societies in the developing world. What could be the financing mechanisms that could kickstart the process of accessibility of these new technologies to the societies that cannot afford it now. But I do not see myself the process of adaptation going forward without a public-private partnership that could kickstart the real projects and adaptation processes in the way that societies can actually manage the change that already happened. It's not even happened. Thus, in some of the countries, change already happened, which unfortunately might be already irreversible to the degree that it already happened. Private business is essential, and civil society that needs to be an inevitable part of raising awareness and then bankrolling in some countries when it comes to the developed world solutions that could be then accessible to the developing world.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me now try to sort of summarize a few of the key points that came out of this. You need all the stakeholders. So you will need both the governments and the civil society and the private sector to be involved. Secondly, that you need to provide a framework for such cooperation to take place and to provide some sort of mechanism of funding for the 100 billion that was promised and has not been fulfilled until now. That may be feasible by an expansion of the role of the multinational development financial institutions. And indeed, as was suggested, one of the possibilities would be to create additional funding in SDRs at the IMF to help remove or diminish the indebtedness and provide finance for the developing countries, and as well as the multilateral development banks and the World Bank, as well as other institutions like the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, which China played a big role in, the Islamic Development Bank and other institutions. All of them can play a role in providing the foundational collateral that helps mobilize private sector funds with the sufficient incentives so that developing countries would be able to access adequate funds for their investments in adaptation and in resilience, funds that would be low interest rate over a long-term horizon rather than borrowing on the international markets, which would be almost impossible. Second, there is, of course, the perennial dissatisfaction that people have with the Security Council, dating back since the Second World War. The 5 seats with the permanent members who have the veto power These were the 5 victors of the Second World War. Clearly, there are many other questions that have arisen. There were other mechanisms that were set up, for including the G7 and now the G20. The G20 is an interesting suggestion. It's going to be hosted this year in Indonesia because Indonesia is a member, and so is India, and so are, basically you have 85% of the world population and about 85 to 90% of the world's economic output represented in those 20 votes. Now, the 20 votes are not really exactly 20 votes. There are 19 votes plus 1, which is the EU. And some of us, including Jeff Sachs and myself, have been arguing that the African Union should have a seat because Africa is now 1.3 billion, roughly, people, and we expect that by the end of the century, it will have trebled or quadrupled in size, and that at least a voice from Africa should be at that table. Why are we concerned about that? Well, the idea being that it may be easier to reach a negotiation agreement between 20 partners than between 193 or 200 plus partners, which is what the General Assembly of the UN would require. And that once this bigger group that represents 85% of the total money and the total population would be committed to something, it would be probably easier to mobilize the remaining votes than the other way around. Whether that would work, I don't know, but I believe we should also think, as was suggested, I think, in the various interventions of the panel, that we will need a multi-pronged strategy. We need, yes, to mobilize the international financial institutions so that they do provide at least a key part of the $100 billion facility that we've been talking about, but also that we need to mobilize public opinion, that we need to mobilize government-to-government negotiations, and ultimately some skillful diplomacy is required. Is that impossible? Well, not quite, because again, recalling earlier moments with Kofi Annan and Jeff and myself and others, we were involved in the Millennium Development Goals and in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why is that important? Well, sustainable development, of course, includes the environmental dimension, but what is important is that this was the first time in history, that we had a unanimous agreement of all the countries of the world on anything. But this time we had it on 8 development goals for the millennium, and 15 years later, we had it for the SDGs. Now, since then, we've had other problems, including the pandemic, including the lockdowns, including the accelerated effect of climate change, and thus we need to find a way of coping with these additional challenges. One additional challenge which is not well enough appreciated is that the success we have had with poverty reduction in the Millennium Development Goals between 2000 and 2015 was largely the result of China's remarkable transformation that took place at that moment, which lifted 700 million people above the poverty line. If you were to exclude China from the calculation, you would see that, in fact, we had not met our targets of poverty reduction. So now that China has stabilized more or less its poverty issue and middle class issue, the question becomes, can we meet the no hunger, no poverty targets, now number 1 and 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals or not? And that, of course, is going to be exacerbated by climate change. Now, climate change appears in many ways inside the Sustainable Development Goals, from Goal 13, which is a climate specific, to the biodiversity on land and on sea, the question of deforestation and the oceans and the like. But it is very much up to us, I think, to be able to rekindle that spirit and idealism that brought us the Millennium Development Goals and that brought us the Sustainable Development Goals, and that gave us a chance to say that all of the world should confront these challenges together. And with that, I would turn to the audience and thank our panelists for their kind contributions on this discussion. So please join me in thanking our panelists.